In this hangar in nearby Miamisburg, a bit of American aviation history has been recreated. The first military aircraft that the Wright brothers sold after making the first flight nearly a decade earlier. It looked just like this one, a Wright Model B Flyer. The chief pilot, retired Navy Commander John Warlick, wears the uniform of a U.S. Army Signal Corps second lieutenant. Warlick says that, like the original Flyer, this is a difficult plane to fly.
So you can turn the wheel for wing drops, and then you have to wait a while before anything happens. So it's I kind of compare it against driving an old worn-out tractor across a plowed field.
For a donation of $125, they'll let you climb aboard the Flyer, and they'll let you experience what early aviators must have felt and seen as their kite-like craft scurried down the runway, the twin chain-driven engines roaring, the frail fabric wings timidly lifting into the sky. The ride is a short one, but in that minute or so, you fly higher and farther than the Wright brothers did on their initial flight. By the way, the staff car used by the group is a Model T, of the same vintage as the airplane.
In our recent living memory, when somebody tries to land an airplane on the White House lawn, we can reasonably conclude it was either an attempted terrorist attack or some mentally deranged individual doing some mentally deranged thing. But the first time it ever happened, the event had a decidedly different flavor. The day was exactly 114 years ago, Friday, 14 July 1911. The pilot was 28-year-old Harry Atwood of Boston, Massachusetts. The aircraft was the Wright Model B. The president was William Howard Taft. And if you know anything about President William Howard Taft, you won't be surprised to learn he made Atwood circle the White House and delay the landing until he was good and finished eating his lunch. It's Monday the 14th of July. This is Curmudgeon's Corner. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where we don't have an airstrip, but we do have a tilting yard, if that counts for anything. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. America and all ships at sea. Welcome to Curmudgeon's Corner. Let's talk about flying lawnmowers, because that's what airplanes still pretty much were in the summer of 1911. The Wright Model B that Harry Atwood flew from Boston to Washington came equipped with a 35 horsepower four-cylinder engine, maximum speed 45 miles per hour, maximum range 117 miles. But it's 567 miles from Boston to Washington, so Atwood has to stop and refuel 3 times along the way. And do you remember Doc Brown in Back to the Future 3 when he said,
"There's not going to be a gas station around here until sometime in the next century"?
Well, that was still largely true in 1911, too. Airplanes have only existed for 8 years. Cars have existed for slightly longer, but they're still very much a novelty item for the super wealthy at this point, so it's not like there's a string of airports where young Mr. Atwood can just pop in and top off his gas tank. And there aren't gas stations everywhere, because there aren't enough cars to warrant them existing yet. So, when it's time to stop and get gas, it's a bit of an improvised ad hoc process when you're an early airplane pilot. First, he's got to find a reasonably flat place where he can land without wrecking the airplane. These things are still made out of balsa wood and sail canvas, after all. Then it's a simple matter of grabbing the gas can out of the back, walking and finding the nearest road, and hoping an automobile goes past at some point, so you can flag the driver down and say, "Pardon me, could I trouble you to take me to your mechanic so I might purchase some gasoline from him for my aeroplane?" And maybe if the mechanic happens to have a telephone, you can call back to Boston and tell him you're still alive. But if not, there really are no means of communicating with anybody when you're en route. The folks in Boston know when you departed, and the folks in Washington know when you're scheduled to arrive. But everything in between, you're on your own, dude. And if you never arrive at the destination, it might never be known what the hell happened to you. A whole lot of early long-distance airplane flight attempts ended that way. Nobody ever found a trace of the man or the airplane. He must have crashed and perished somewhere along the way. And Harry Atwood, despite the fact he was attempting a world record distance flight, he wasn't even an experienced pilot, at least to the extent that there was any such thing as an experienced pilot in those days. He'd only had his first flying lesson, less than 90 days earlier, at the world's first and only flying school, which only just opened the previous year in 1910, and we're still in the period of aviation history when the Wright brothers effectively dominated the industry by themselves through the aggressive enforcement of their various patents. So if you wanted an airplane, it had to be a Wright airplane. If you wanted to learn how to fly it, you had to go to the Wright Flying School outside Dayton, Ohio, which today is the site of Maxwell Air Force Base. And the first classes they turned out were probably a more eclectic mix of people than you might imagine. There were military and civilian, men and women, a surprising number of women, in fact. The Wright brothers don't appear to have had any chauvinistic attitudes or notions about women pilots. If you showed up and you were willing to play, they would bloody well teach you to fly. And from the military perspective, the Army was very interested in purchasing some aeroplanes and exploring what their martial applications might potentially be. But they don't have anybody who knows how to fly one, so as soon as the Wright Flying School opens its doors, then the Army starts sending young officers there to hopefully form the nexus of a new corps of military aviators. And one of those young officers, one of Harry Atwood's classmates, in fact, was the future General Hap Arnold, Chief of Staff of the Army Air Corps in the Second World War, first Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force after the war, and the only five-star general in Air Force history. But here's the thing about teaching people to fly airplanes. You can't really do it in the first generation of Wright flyers, because the damn thing has only got one seat. Hell, it had 0 seats originally, and you're going to wreck a lot of airplanes and kill a lot of students if your only option is to send them up on a solo flight and hope for the best. So that's where the Model B comes in. From Orville and Wilbur deciding, if we want this aviation thing to really take off, we're going to need an airplane that 2 people can occupy. And so they built the Model B with 2 seats, redundant controls on each side, and a single common stick in the middle. So if you were the instructor, you worked the throttle with your left hand and the stick with your right. And if you were the student, you worked the stick with your left and the throttle with your right. And they made another big change to the Model B when they moved the elevator assembly from the front to the back, which drastically improved visibility and controllability. But the other thing it did was to make all crashes effectively fatal. Because if you're hurtling into the ground nose first in a Model A, you have at least got something in front of you that can potentially absorb some of the impact forces and make the crash slightly more survivable. But if you move that elevator to the back, after that, if you hit the ground, you are hitting it face first. And the other big innovation they made on the Model B, the thing that enabled Harry Atwood to attempt his big White House display, was they gave it a set of wheels, in addition to the skids that they had on the Model A. The Model A, you had to launch that thing off of a rail, assisted either by a catapult or some guys pushing it from behind. And you landed it on the skids, which didn't make for a very smooth touchdown more often than not. In fact, a lot of the early Wright flyers got wrecked just in the act of executing a normal landing. So they stuck a couple of oversized bicycle wheels on there and some primitive shock absorbers. This is the Wright brothers, after all. Their training was as bicycle mechanics, so they always naturally defaulted to bicycle-based technology whenever it was time to solve an engineering problem. And this had the effect of not only enabling the aircraft to make unassisted takeoffs, but it made landings a lot less sketchy and a lot less likely to cause irreparable damage to the aircraft. So how much runway did Harry Atwood have to work with when he landed on the south lawn of the White House and then took off again? Well, I wasn't able to find any official published dimensions of the space, but I did scale it on Google Earth, and I came up with a figure of around 450 feet. Half as much runway as you've got on an aircraft carrier, basically. And did it occur to anybody that maybe it's not the best idea to let some barely trained pilot set this experimental vehicle down on the president's front yard? Nah, it didn't. It was a simpler time, after all. Hell, it wasn't even until 1935 that they got around to closing the airspace above the White House. The Aero Club of Washington thought this stunt would be a great opportunity to publicize the burgeoning aviation industry, and President Taft was in full agreement. He thought it was just a splendid idea, as long as he didn't get his lunch interrupted. And obviously, there's no such thing as air-to-ground radio communication in those days. So when Atwood arrives over the White House and does his first circle of the landing zone in order to get his bearings and decide on the best approach to take, his friends on the ground have got to figure out some way of communicating to him to say, don't land yet, the president wants to finish his lunch, so just hang tight, do a few more circles, we'll let you know when you're clear to touch down, which they apparently succeeded in doing somehow, and I would be fascinated to know how they pulled it off. but the sources are silent on that point, regrettably. The sources also make no mention of what Atwood's fuel situation was at this point, but it can't have been very favorable since his last refueling stop was in South New Jersey, and his maximum range was the aforementioned 117 miles, so it's probably safe to say he was either on fumes or close to being on fumes. But hey, when the president wants to finish his lunch, you let the president finish his damn lunch. History doesn't record what Taft ate for his midday meal on that particular Friday, but we can probably assume it was enough food to keep someone like me alive for several weeks. This is the Edwardian age, after all. So an obese man is a man of wealth and power and privilege, as I'm sure Taft reminded himself that time that his aides had to grease him up in order to extricate his fat ass from the White House bathtub. Is that less dignified than Joe Biden getting lost in his own closet? Probably, but at least Taft never claimed to have just spoken to a world leader who died 27 years ago. Eventually, the president appears on the front portico and gives the signal that the landing may now proceed, which I'm sure came as a relief to young Mr. Atwood. Remember, he doesn't have a gas gauge. They haven't invented those just yet. He just has to fill up the tank and try to count the number of miles he has flown and hope against hope that he doesn't suddenly sputter out and drop from the sky like a wounded duck. And wouldn't that have made for a fun news story the next day? Young Aviator perishes in fiery wreck as President finishes dessert. But it never came to that, thankfully. Atwood does one final circle, gets himself lined up, and he winds up using 420 of the 450 feet of landing zone that are available to him. For the sources record that he rolled smoothly to a halt 30 feet directly in front of a very excited, very impressed President Taft, who presented the young man with a gold medal and a presidential commendation. And then the representatives of the Aero Club of Washington gave him a certificate commemorating this brand new world record long distance flight of 567 miles. Then they turned the airplane around and sent him back on his merry way, presumably after he had secured a fresh tank of gas from the White House garages. Harry Atwood, almost uniquely among the early aviation pioneers, most of whom never saw their 30th birthday, he winds up living to the ripe old age of 83. And what day does he die? July 14th, 1967. Exactly 56 years to the day after his most famous achievement, and only 2 years before men would walk on the surface of the moon while standing on the shoulders of people, men and women, just like him. I'm done. That's all I've got. See you next time. Get off my lawn.